And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our live program, the United Nations in action. Our choices of exclusive interviews we have been doing over the past few years with movers of the World Organization right after this break. Live from Beijing, you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you from CGTN. Next, we turn to our special program for today, UN in Action. This week, the world celebrates United Nations Day, which marks the anniversary of the ratified UN Charter in 1945. Next year, the UN will enter its 75th year. Since its inception, the UN has reached the critical stage of its 2030 agenda, but it faces many challenges. Some question its multilateral existence, some oppose globalization. So how is it coping, the UN? Well, UN's plan and actions from the voices, some important voices coming from the United Nations. Today in our program, first of all, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. Let's hear what he had to say about now and the immediate future. The world is in an interesting paradox, Mr. Secretary General. I'm sure you know better than I do. On the one hand, it's ever more integrated than any time before. On the other hand, it's getting apparently ever more divided as well as to where to go. How do you see that paradox?
With great concern. Challenges are global, and there is no way to address a global challenge if we don't have a multilateral approach and if we don't have norms that are accepted by everybody. And unfortunately, this is being put into question. We see more and more unilateral initiatives, we see more and more people putting into question the kind of rules that were accepted by everybody in different areas, be it in trade, be it in questions of peace and security or whatever. And so I do believe that this is a moment in which we need to be very strongly committed to multilateral institutions, to strengthen them, and to be very strongly committed to a rules-based international order.
But Mr. Secretary General, of course, as the Secretary General of the United Nations, which is supposed to be an organization based on rules accepted by everybody, you would always say that. But what about the parties that seem to be not necessarily convinced about this logic that you have been advocating?
I think we need to make people understand that a unilateral solution might sometimes seem to be immediately producing positive impacts. But in the long term, we need to have win-win solutions. Because if we have zero-sum solutions for our problems, those that might be winning today will lose tomorrow. And we need sustainable solutions, especially in a world that is smaller and smaller. We need to be able to have inclusive solutions in which consultations are held in a way that everybody can participate. That is the only way to solve the problems of this world in a way in which everybody can benefit. And so, as I said, totally committed to multilateral governance, totally committed to a rules-based international order.
Mr. Secretary General, are you prepared or do you have a plan B if some of the concerned parties continue to do and to provoke in terms of the rules of the world? How would you handle the ever-evolving situation every day, it seems, Mr. Secretary General?
Well, we only have a plan A. Our plan A is the Charter of the United Nations, is to do everything we can, everywhere, to, first of all, prevent conflicts and to try to solve them, to be able to promote an agenda that was agreed by all countries in the world, the Agenda 2030 for sustainable development, for inclusive development, for a fair globalization, to fight against climate change, that is the most dramatic threat to our life as a planet, and at the same time to promote human rights in all its dimensions, economic, social, political, civilian. So this is our agenda, this is the Charter, this is what we must do. If something fails here or there, we need to do everything possible to mobilize the international community in order to be able to fill the gaps that might exist And I must say that even if we feel that countries that no longer are supporting several initiatives or whatever, I see more and more the young people totally committed to cosmopolitan values. If you talk of the youth doesn't like protectionism. The youth doesn't like nationalism. The youth likes to
They're
feel
much more beyond borders.
Citizens of the world. No, they communicate everywhere, and this is my hope for the future. So we are having some hiccups at the present moment, but we'll overcome them.
My exclusive interview with Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. His firm belief, multilateral system, rule-based system. The United Nations Development Program, on the other hand, or the UNDP, has lent a hand to China with a long history of collaboration. The UNDP has supported China through advisory and funding services, especially when China was just starting out at the very beginning of China's reform and opening up. Earlier, I also had an occasion to sit down with Achim Steiner, the administrator of the UNDP. He himself witnessed the great changes taking place in this country over the years. Achim, as a close observer of China, what do you make of the real thing China has made it over the past 40 years?
What we in the world often see through the lens of economics is, however, far more. Yes, GDP has grown many times. People have become wealthier in terms of income per capita and households. But really the transformation of China is also one of urbanization, industrialization, maintaining a development pathway that also looked at urban and rural economy. I think from the beginning the desire, the commitment to not allow rapid development only to benefit the few, but to be inclusive, was part of the design. So the extraordinary number of people who were moved out of poverty and extreme poverty is part of that story.
China does not want to be the one that's saying, oh, you just follow me and then you will do as well as I do. And China didn't want either to say, well, I had some rich experiences, but I just don't feel like sharing with you guys. Yeah. But that's a very delicate balance in a way.
You see, part of the role and the mandate of UNDP is to connect development experiences. So we have obviously been invited into China in 1979 to help inform Chinese decision-making about development. Today, we are increasingly also drawing on China's own modernization concepts, just like we brought sometimes China into contact with, for instance, the concept of special economic zones in the 1980s, 1990s. Over many years, China has been drawing on international lessons learned, using it to design its domestic policies. Today, the China Council is also a platform for the world to draw on China's own experience. And I think, as you point out, no country should assume that its own development model is automatically applicable to another nation. Culture, history, geography, all of these influence national decision-making. But we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time, and that is what good development, networking and learning is all about. Take the best of what others have found, adapt it to your own context, and find a national way to inform development choices.
The UNICEF is working to provide urgent assistance to vulnerable children around the world. Who better to ask those efforts than Henrietta Fore, the Undersecretary General of the United Nations, who's also the UNICEF Executive Director. For more than 4 decades, she has worked to champion economic development, education, health, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief in both public service and the private sector. Here's what she had to say. ED4, as you may know, many of these children, they do not have necessarily a family connection, which means these children have to act alone. And therefore, many of the supplies that you're talking about, many of the opportunities that you're talking about, these children might not have enough strength to grab them. Yes. So how to make sure that those children are having the real opportunity and equal opportunity with those children that are having families?
Yes. Yes, yes, you're exactly right. And so that's part of the puzzle of working with children, Children have to feel safe.
Yes.
They have to feel protected.
They're the weakest party.
Yes, they are, and they're the most affected by all of this violence. So if we can create child-friendly places and places of rest where they can just pause in terms of everything around them falling apart, that helps. And then if we can get protection services, because as you know, if you're a young person, you're alone, you're very vulnerable.
Yes.
You're vulnerable to groups that might want to grab you for their
Whatever
militia,
reason, yes.
or for other purposes, trafficking in young people. So having safe places for children is very much part of our duty and our responsibility worldwide.
We have this massive debate in the world over the past 2 to 3 years about whether international system after World War II, whether international mechanisms such as the UN, UNICEF included, is still going to work. Are they still relevant? Should they still be the backbone of an international governance system?
So the United Nations system is a remarkable creation, and it did come out of wartime when there was an emergency need. And sometimes what that leads to is that people begin to lose interest because there's no longer an emergency at hand. And yet,
or they don't realize there is an emergency at hand.
Yes. And so we have 300 emergencies a year now. It is extremely important for the world to not lose hope, to not lose confidence. So when I see an organization like UNICEF that is capable, on the ground, can respond in times of crises and in times of just hope, then I would grab it. I would use it. I would try to make sure that every child in the world has nutrition, has education, has health care, sanitation, water, and protection. So why not use it? It's here. It's available.
As regional conflicts escalated, a million people around the world were forced to flee their homes. The UNHCR is funding for the relocation and settlement of refugees worldwide. In a talk with Filippo Grandi, the High Commissioner of UN Refugee Agency, he tells us about efforts to help refugees find a new home. You yourself was stationed in Afghanistan for about 4 years. You know exactly what is going on there. What do you make of this long extension of work that you have to focus on, even about one country, about one war?
Refugee crisis can happen in a matter of hours. Huge movements. In 1979, millions of Afghans fled Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion. And now, almost 40 years later, we still don't have a solution because, much as crises are fast, solutions are slow. Why? Because solutions depend on peacemaking and peace building, and both are slow processes.
Funding is a big issue. How to encourage them to contribute so that you do your work?
More than 90% of the funding is from voluntary sources, mostly from governments, donor governments. Well, we have to convince them that supporting refugees and displaced people is an important humanitarian imperative, but it is also in their interest, because the more you support refugees, the more you meet their needs and, if I may say, give them opportunities, the more you ensure that they're not a threat to overall stability and security. What we want now is the involvement of bigger actors that bring additional resources.
Who are the bigger actors to you?
The World Bank is a very good example. We are currently helping the World Bank program resources up to $2 billion in 10 countries in Africa and Asia to address refugee situations. This is the first time in history that we do it at this scale, and I hope that other large development actors will follow suit.
The used to be held high moral standards seem to be threatened by the rise of xenophobia in the world, and the fact that some countries tend to look more inward rather being more international. So what you're asking, Mr. High Commissioner, might not be possible.
The concerns of people in Europe, in America, and in other places regarding these areas are very real. We cannot ignore them as maybe we have done in the past. We have to address that in the right manner, in a mature manner, but we also have to pass the message of openness.
Behind closed doors, how are you convincing them?
One of the most important things to be done, is to invest more to try and solve the root causes of these forced population movements. First, stop the wars, and that also requires unity on the part of the international community. And second, address problems that compound those created by wars, poverty and climate change in particular.
The UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. Those are some of the words repeated by many, coming from one of those former Secretary Generals of the United Nations. They have come to serve as a mission statement of sorts. How can the UN manage to keep the world from disaster? The UN and China have worked together to do just that, with efforts in many areas: innovation, protection of intellectual property, and the Belt and Road Initiative, and many other things. Let's hear from the heads of other UN agencies about all of these. Earlier, the Secretary General of the United Nations talking about international institutions of the 20th century only. However, we are facing the 21st century sets of challenges, including, I guess, with the UN. What does it mean to the UN, given the current circumstances?
Well, the United Nations is premised on the idea that nations are ready to come together to work together to solve global problems. Yes. And today we're living a fundamental contradiction where global problems are arguably more acute than ever before. And I'm thinking of climate change, I'm thinking of the disruptive effect of new technologies, I'm thinking of demographic changes with aging populations in many regions and youth bulges in the others. I'm thinking of growing problems of inequality within and between countries. And these are all problems that can only be solved through global cooperation. And yet at the same time, many nations are turning their back, or at least not giving the same priority to international cooperation, to global solution solving. So we really have a discrepancy between some of the challenges we're facing and the readiness of countries to work together to address those challenges. And that threatens the sustainability of a peaceful future. And I think that's very worrying. It's also worrying in terms of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals.
Whether it's development, whether it's peace and security, whether it's the governance, global governance issue, these are all facing daily challenges. And therefore, how would you expect people to be able to look forward to the so-called common consensus and the common issue? Is it realistic, Mr. Assistant Secretary General?
Well, who is there out there who doesn't care about the future of their children or grandchildren? I think that's real. Everybody there does. And yes, there are many negative trends that are tremendously worrying, but there are also important steps forward. I mean, despite the geopolitics, the G20 agreed on an important declaration regarding use of the internet and counterterrorism. Despite geopolitics, there was the Christchurch Declaration, which was about hate speech in social media, which was very important. The Secretary General just articulated an important policy on hate speech, which got broad support from member states. Despite the trends, the vast majority of nations at the end of last year agreed on an international compact on migration, which is a very controversial subject, which nobody ever believed you could get agreement around. So the trends are contradictory, and there's no lack of negative developments, but that shouldn't make us lose sight of the positive forces out there. And I think among youth, youth is ever more conscious of social responsibility, ever more conscious of our responsibility towards the planet, and ever more conscious of their place not just as citizens of this or that country, but of global citizens. And let's build on hope, not build on fear. I think that's part of the problem. We need policies that take realistic hope as their basis, rather than fear of others as their basis.
What are some of the things with the Chinese progress or with the Chinese way of try to approach this issue that you think can be inspiring or used as reference to the other parts of the world? I mean, after all, this is the largest developing country.
Yes, indeed. So look, I would say, if I may, first of all, there is something that has been present constantly in China, and that is a strategic focus from the top. And we see it, of course, with President Xi Jinping, who has a very big strategic focus on innovation and on intellectual property as a part of innovation. I mean, I think we always must remember that the reason we have intellectual property is to promote innovation, to ensure a safe passage for ideas through to the marketplace. So this is one lesson for, I think, everyone, is having this focus and support of the leadership means that the whole system can adapt to embrace the idea of intellectual property. Then I think that is combined with a very pragmatic approach of ensuring that actually the mechanics of the system function. So we've seen that, I mean, as I mentioned just a moment ago, 1.54 million patent applications, about 7 million trademark applications.
Actually, I'm amazed that, by the way, you can remember all these numbers about every country, China included.
But getting through those, you know, and getting through them in a timely manner that serves the market and with quality, that's quite a task. And then building the outreach in this extremely large and diverse country, getting the buy-in to the system. These are all lessons, I think, for everyone.
The top-down approach, of course, is sometimes quite unique to China. But how much inspirations do you think China has also acquired from the rest of the world?
My observation is that China studies very carefully practices in other countries around the world, absorbs them, and comes out with its own version of them. This studied approach is, I think, admirable. It's a very open approach.
What do you mean by open approach?
Well, it's open to listening to others and to studying what others have been doing.
Who are the others you're referring to?
Usually study visits to Europe, to various European countries, the United States of America, to all other countries within the Asian region, and of course increasingly China has a leading position in this area. But that has been the case since the beginning. And you mentioned, you know, the beginnings, rather recent beginnings of the modern era of intellectual property.
Belt and Road Initiative. Many wonder, what is that? And what is going to be the relationship between the work that you are doing at UNIDO and the Belt and Road Initiative, which is about infrastructure?
Chinese government, President Xi mentioned BRI, and also at the UN, we are working very hard to develop 2030 Sustainable Development Goals initiative, and also 2030 Development Agenda. Actually, both of them rooted in the vision of the shared prosperity. That is a core of the BRI, and also the core of the SDG development goals, yes. Poverty reduction.
Well, different economies are thinking about their own industrial policies. Some of them even think about the other parties' industrial policy could be a potential threat, if not a challenge. So as UNIDO, how would you be able to play this balancing act?
Some countries become advanced become high income, become industrialized, all through the industrial development. No exception. But now, for the least developed country, poor country, developing country, now they're struggling for industrialization decades, 30, 40, 50 years, but they're still not catching up. But some of the good examples, like China, like maybe Republic Korea and Japan and Southeast Asian countries, they move much faster.
Right.
Why they can move faster? That is also one of the hints that we need to share the experience for them, together with them. So I think that this is one of the issues we are now working on.
Yeah.
Second is approach to industrial development. Of course, when we mention the manufacturing industry, it consumes 30%, at least 30% of total energy, and costs 30% of the total emission to the global climate issue. So this is why the second challenge is when we promote industrial development, we should be green, should be sustainable. And country may argue, oh, we need to do industry first, then come back to the environment.
It's too
as
late.
I elected in 2013, I strongly push the member states to support inclusive and sustainable industrialization. And for green sustainability and the industry, there's no option.
UN in action, a world based on hope, a world that is not based on fear. Very important message. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. The weekend is here. Have a good one, everyone. Bye for now.